presentations with a focus on virtual forums, presented by Ryan Boyd. My name is Ryan Starkey, and I'll be chairing this Virtual Insight session. Ryan Boyd is originally from South Africa with 8 years of consulting experience, including being a manager at Deloitte. He's now based in Brisbane and is the head of corporate actuarial for the APAC region at Allianz Partners. This includes being a corporate social responsibility or CSR champion at Allianz Partners, driving initiatives and promoting the importance of CSR to various stakeholders. On top of his actuarial career, Ryan is passionate about developing his own and helping others develop their presentation skills, which we can all agree is a must-have when presenting complex actuarial messages to various stakeholders. Ryan has over 16 years of presenting experience from his career, TEDx, motivational speaking, and CSR advocacy. During this session, Ryan will share many universal tips and tricks to make you better equipped and confident for your next presentation, whether it is at work or on another topic entirely. Today's session will be delivered in 3 parts. The first 50 minutes will focus on presenting, followed by 10 minutes of reflection and a short break. The next 30 minutes will focus on facilitation, and then we will finish with 30 minutes of Q&A and an open discussion. There will be opportunities to participate in polls and ask questions along the way. The polls will automatically appear in your Zoom window, and you can simply answer by following the on-screen instructions. To ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen at any time during the session. We'll answer questions throughout the presentation at various different points, but any unanswered questions we'll leave to the end and address those during the Q&A. This presentation is also being recorded. It's now my absolute pleasure to hand over to Ryan Boyd. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate that. So just maybe before I start, just to ask, can everybody hear me, or at least those who can reply? Maybe we can test out that comment section. Just let us know that you can hear us, you can see us, and everything is clear from your side. Everything okay? Perfect, fantastic. So it is my great pleasure to also welcome you. It would seem it's the Ryan show today with Ryan S and Ryan B coordinating things today, but it's an absolute pleasure to have you here today and to be here today. As you would have picked up from the introduction from Ryan S, that I am originally from South Africa. And if you didn't hear the introduction, you probably pick it up from my accent. I don't have an ordinary Australian accent. Although I am picking up a couple of terms and a couple of accents here and there, depending on the word that I'm using. But I have really enjoyed the privilege of being here in Australia for the last 2 years in Allianz Partners, where I take up the role of, as you've heard, head of corporate actuarial. And the privilege for me to really be here today is really around the opportunity to talk about a topic that I am extremely passionate about. It might sound a little bit weird when you're presenting on presenting. And I'd like to also clear up that I am by no means a self-proclaimed expert in any field whatsoever. It is a topic, though, that I am extremely passionate about. And my goal really behind today's session is to further equip you, to give you tips and tricks that I've learned over the last 16 years or so of presenting, to hopefully empower you with your presentations that you either do in work or away from work in different forms or means. I remember the very first time that I presented 16 years ago. In fact, it was at a Sunday school in Cape Town, South Africa, where I taught a story to a classroom of children. And I remember the feeling I had towards the end of that, where I was really passionate about the opportunity to talk about something, first of all, that I was passionate about, but also having the opportunity to use the word and the skill that I had to be able to empower others to hopefully be impacted by the topic that I was talking about that day. 16 years later, I've had many privileges along the way to be able to talk in TEDx events, representing the United Nations, and then also doing various other talks and means, of course, in the actuarial field as well. And I know that is something that we would all feel we'd be able to relate to, because in any way or form, actuaries are being more and more relied upon to present on very technical, difficult topics, whether it be to the board, whether it be in upskilling formats, whether it be on insight sessions going forward. There are many opportunities for actuaries to get involved and to share the skills that we have on a technical front as well. So that will be what today is about. So I'm going to attempt the first technological feat if I'm able to actually share my screen. And we can start. Perfect. So Ryan S, can that be seen on your side?
Coming through.
Perfect, fantastic. Great. So we've gotten through the introductory part, but I'm going to start things off by actually not talking too much more about myself, but I actually want to get to know you a little bit better as the audience. So we have a poll that we are wanting to ask, and if you can, it would be fantastic if you can contribute. You'll see on your screen, there are 3 questions. One, which state are you from? If you could just click the relevant states. How many years of work experience do you have? And then lastly, out of 10, whether it would be 1 being I have absolutely no comfort in presenting, and 10 being I'm very comfortable with presenting. So I'll give you about 30 seconds or so just to give us your answers, and we'll learn a little bit about each other in a few seconds' time. So which state are you from? How many years of work experience do you have? And out of 10, how comfortable are you with presenting? And I hope what will happen is once the answers are in, that we will be able to showcase that. Fantastic. So we have some answers here. We can see for our question 1, which states are you from? That majority of our audience is from New South Wales, being 59% of those who contributed to the poll, 25 Victoria, and 11% here in Queensland. By the way, if I hadn't mentioned it, I am actually coming to you live from my dining room in Brisbane, Queensland. Let's see if we can get to the other answers here. How many years of work experience do you have? So we actually have a fairly experienced audience that we have with us today, which is fantastic. 10 to 15 years worth of experience, making up 31% of our audience, 20 plus years making up 29%. So fantastic to see an experienced audience with us today. And a very interesting, I guess, very relative answer to give. Out of 10, how comfortable are we in terms of presenting? A large percentage, or most percentage, sitting at 7 out of 10, which is fantastic. I take from that, which links to the years of experience, that you would have had many opportunities to present, and that is fantastic. And I think this links very closely to what I was hoping to see from an audience perspective for this talk in particular. Now, there are a number of reasons. I'm assuming you can see back onto the slides. Is that a fair assumption? Perfect. So there is a number of reasons why I would want to actually put a poll out like this. And this can be the very first little tip and trick that I can share with you today on presenting. When it comes to these polls and questions, we want to try and understand as presenters, who are we talking to? Because that's going to tee up the way and the tone in which I'll be presenting the topics going forward. I now know just from these questions that majority of our audience is from New South Wales, which means that if I had any New South Wales specific commentary or anything happening in the world today that is specific to New South Wales, I can mention that along the way in my presentation, which then also builds up a little bit of a connection with the audience, depending on how the answer went about. I can also mention about how I'm from Queensland, and I can give a bit of a shout out to our Queensland audience at the time. The second two, or the last 2 questions, are also not only beneficial for the audience, because we're all human beings, we all want to know a little bit about the other people that are in the audience as well. We want to know, how do we compare somebody else from Queensland, New South Wales? How many years of experience is everybody else in the audience as well? So these are all relevant, good questions for the audience to feel like they are part of the presentation, but also it's beneficial for me as the presenter, because I now know that I have a more experienced audience. And relatively speaking, a lot of people feel a little bit more comfortable with actually presenting to various different audiences, which also then means that I'm not necessarily going to be focusing on the basics of presenting. These are areas which you would most likely get taught in the professionalism exams or other courses, or during your different forms of study, or in your company learning types of facilities. So I'm going to be focusing very much in this session on the extra content. We will be looking at, which you'll see in our presentation, when I look at the agenda that we are wanting to focus on, that there are the ordinary buckets that we'll be focusing on. Your preparation, practice, intro, content, and of course our conclusion and questions. It's very difficult to stray away from this sort of a structure, and it's something that you would have most likely been shown at some stage in your learning experiences. However, something that I really want to emphasize at this point in time is that we do want to make sure that the preparation and practice components of the presentation is never ignored or treated like something that is inferior to the other components or other buckets of the presentation that we'll be dealing with today. So I might pause there just in terms of the polls or the content that we're going to be going through in the different buckets, and just ask if there are any questions at this stage or any comments that Ryan S. is currently looking after for us. Anything to mention at this point?
No questions at this point.
Perfect. No, fantastic. The key to whether there are no questions or not usually means one of two things. Either that at a very early stage, you've put the entire audience to sleep, or everything that you've mentioned was perfectly clear. So I'm going to go on the great assumption that everything was perfectly clear for everybody in the audience today. Well, before we get into all of the agenda and all those 4 buckets, I'd like to probably just bring out to your attention the 4 main presentation types that we see in the world today, specifically looking at the actuarial format or actuarial content that we would see in our day-to-day jobs or in other walks of life. So from my experience, I've noted that there are 4 main types of presentations. One would be the upskilling component. This is something that we would be used to when we are busy upskilling our actuarial teams or other departments, depending on your experience level and area that you've been involved with. And this would very much look like an IFRS 17 presentation, reserving types of presentations, things where we are there to educate the audience in different forms and areas. And this is a fantastic area to just mention that the type of content here would be very simple, so to speak. When I say that, I mean, we don't want to overload our audience with information in this type of format. We want to make sure that for the actual presentation, the message is clear, concise, to the point, and making sure that our audience actually learns something from the actual type of presentation. Another presentation that we'd be familiar with is motivational types of presentations. This would be your regular TED types of talks, something that is designed to introduce an idea, give a bit of a shock factor in terms of educating the audience on what is going on in this area around the world, introduce a possible solution to this problem and a thought for us to think about to change our lives. And then right at the end, it'd be a challenge to the audience, like, why don't you take this challenge seriously and attempt to change your life to meet this need that is in the audience? And by the end of it, the idea is to make people feel motivated to do this and feel encouraged and have the tools and means to be able to do that. Another form of presentation is advertising. And I mean this with the absolute utmost love and respect, but this is where you would mostly see in the actuarial context from our consulting friends in the actuarial field. You'd notice these types of presentations look absolutely incredible because, of course, our consultants spend money in the marketing side of it to make sure that they look attractive and slick. And at the same time, our consultants would want to make sure that there's a lot of information on these slides to showcase the fact that the consultant knows a lot about this certain topic that they are wanting to present. And then, of course, right at the end of this presentation will be the opportunity to give contact details. If you would like to know more about this topic or ways that we as Consultant Company X can help you with it, please contact us or come see our website, and then we'll be able to take the conversation further. And then lastly, a very familiar bucket or type of presentation that we'd be involved with as actuaries would be reporting. This is usually our once a month, once a quarter, once a year types of presentations, where depending on the specialist field that you're involved in, you would be wanting to give an update either to the board, to your manager, to any stakeholders around the world that you would be involved with. I personally am very involved in this in my role when it comes to reserving updates, when it comes to IFRS 17 updates, getting involved in pricing discussions across underwriting departments. These are areas where we would want to give information, but a key part of the reporting bucket would be that most likely the people and the audience that we're presenting to would not be an actuarial audience, and sometimes not even technically minded, so to speak, in the more granular detail of the calculations that we're working on. They'd more want to understand is, well, what does this mean for them? How do we translate our technical knowledge and our technical language into a language that the board would want to know and understand and care for, which usually ends up in a P&L discussion, profit and loss. How does this impact the bottom line? And also, how does this impact the future of the business? And how are we contributing to that? This is an area which I'll be completely honest with you, where actuaries and actually most professions around the world struggle with. Because what's our temptation? Our temptation as professionals is that we would like to showcase exactly how difficult it was to derive this number that you see before you. How many years of training it took for us to derive a chain ladder and to derive an ultimate and claim reserves and so on. It was particularly difficult. And when you see one number, sometimes it can portray as if it was easy. But that's not the point of a reporting presentation. The point is, how does this translate to our stakeholders? And I will showcase a couple of examples of this a little bit later in our presentation, just to showcase what I mean by some of these, and also to give some helpful tips and tricks at that stage of how you can possibly use them in your own way to bolster up the understanding or the message and make it a bit clearer to our stakeholders along the way. I might pause there as well and just ask if there are any questions about that, or any challenges or any other experience that may have come across in these presentation types.
Nothing too particular yet. One comment to, make sure you share some key tips, and I'm sure we'll get to those along the way.
Yes, no, absolutely. No, the idea here is that we want to share some key tips along the way, of course, of the presentation. Fantastic. Then if we move over to our next component, so we're going to first practice, we're first looking at the preparation and the practice buckets of our presentation. And at this time, I'm going to open up another poll and ask the audience a question here. Which part of the presentation, in your experience, would you say is the most important part of a presentation? Is it the tone in which we speak, the words that we speak, or the body language that we are using during the course of the presentation? So I'll just give you a couple of seconds to look at that. Tone, words, or body language. And then the results of that should show up once it's ready. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And interesting results that came out of it, and actually not too different from what I was hoping to see, which is fantastic. Majority of our audience believes that the tone is the most important part of which we speak, in the manner of which we speak in our presentations. Second in those polling results would be our body language at 26%. And then lastly would be the actual words and content that comes from the actual presentation. And I would say that this is a very interesting discussion, because if we do move over to our next slide, there has been a presentation that's or a exercise or an experiment that's happened from a psychological perspective to try and understand these different communication styles and how they impact us as an audience and how we receive the message. And I want to compare that with what we got in the polls. So if we move over to what the answer came from that experiment, a little bit different in terms of the tone and body language, but actually what came from that was the body language which we are using actually attributes 55% of the communication or the message that comes across, followed by the tone at 38%, and only 7% is attributable to the words. So why do I put this question out there, and why do I show the results on this? Well, as actuaries, we focus very heavily on the content that we are wanting to present. And this is, of course, of extreme importance, and it's important that the content is correct, and it's something that we're wanting to make sure that message is abundantly clear. However, as well as it is important when we do it face-to-face, on the virtual format, when it comes to looking at a camera like I am right now, there's absolutely no difference in terms of how we get that communication across. That's why the camera that you're looking at is of utmost importance. You'll notice that I'm trying my utmost best to make sure I keep looking at that lens on the computer itself, so that you can see that I am looking at your eyes, or look, you should be able to see on your screen, my eyes looking at you. You should be able to see the fact that I'm using my hands, I'm standing, I'm using my body as best I can to make sure that our body language is clear to you. The tone in which we speak is something also quite important. Anyone that has any form of relationship, when it comes to a friend, a partner, any kind of relationship, family member, you might have had a conversation in your life about the tone in which you say something. It's not only important what you're saying, because what you're saying is in your head sounds perfect, but when you say it, it comes across in a certain way, the tone in which you say it. And that is I guess, the core concept of how misunderstandings can happen. Very much alike when it comes to the presentations that we do. Why I put this question into the preparation and practice part is I want to ask the question to you, not for a poll, but just to answer yourself quietly in your own minds, is how much time do you spend on the content when you are practicing and preparing for your presentations versus these other two very important components? Is the tone correct in the manner in which I speak? And also, is the body language that I'm using also respectful and also appropriate for the actual presentation that you're giving? Now, at times you'll have in virtual meetings and not the opportunity to share your screen. Like unfortunately now I can't see your faces, but then the ratio still remains. Then the tone becomes even more important when it comes to the message we're trying to speak, because you want to make sure that the message is clear in combination with the words that we are in fact using as well. Any questions or comments on that poll, or anything that we'd like to have clearer?
We do have a couple of questions, so I think people are warming up and ready to start asking questions. And just a reminder, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window to do so. Just quickly jumping back to the sort of speaker styles. One question is, should the reporting presentation type steal approaches from motivating and advertising, or should it be its own style distinctly? What characteristics clearly delineate the types to you?
Yeah. And that's a great question. And I think it's like most answers in life, there's no such thing as just clear black and white in terms of two different categories. You'll always have an opportunity for the different styles to actually blend into one another. You may, in one presentation, take aspects of each type of these presentations. As an example, if you are doing a reporting type of presentation, you're wanting to make sure that the results that's happened over the case or over the course of the quarter or the year, you want to make sure that those numbers are accurate. You want to make sure that it's clear, our stakeholders understand what that means. But as a result from that presentation of reporting, there may be a need to get buy-in from the board to give you more resources to be able to improve the process going forward. And that then might lend itself to a little bit of an advertising type of discussion or presentation, when we say that, well, this is what we could do this year. But if we had X, Y, and Z, we could improve that. And if we could improve it, you could expect to see X, Y, and Z as well after that. But at the end of the day, should you want us to improve these things, we need buy-in from the board. And if you'd like to communicate and chat about that, let's have a chat in a separate meeting, maybe a week from now, and you can let us know if this is something that you would be interested in. You'd also maybe cross in some motivational aspects to it. If we are trying to look at reporting as the example again, is if we look at the last year in 2020 being a COVID year, this might have made that reporting discussion incredibly difficult. And it might be that we have some bad news to deliver. So at the end of that bad news delivery, we might need to try and motivate our audience and say that, but you know what? Next year is a new year. We have learned a lot from this last year in 2020, which gives us some more data, something to analyze, something to be able to improve our process in 2021. Will it be as bad a year? Who knows? But we will be more prepared for it. And in that kind of area, you get a blend of these different types of presentations. Hopefully that answers your question going forward. Maybe one more question, Ryan, if there's time.
Sure, sounds good. There's one comment as well about the tone, words, and body language. And one attendee's recommended that they say that the enthusiasm of the speaker really talks to them. And I think, yeah, I would agree. And it really comes across each of those three features. So that's also an important note. But in terms of a question, out of curiosity, in case Ryan B doesn't cover it, how does he keep the flow without umming, eyeing, or rambling at all? Is he reading a script or outline, or does he have some special technique? Has he prepared much for today's session?
Well, I hope the underlying message there is that I'm not coming across like I'm umming and eyeing a lot, and that it doesn't come across like I've prepared a lot. But I'm going to go on the assumption that it's coming across okay. We do talk a lot about that during the course of the presentation. So I will mention some tips and tricks that I have along the way. So if I don't answer your question at that time, please, we can bring it up again at the end when it comes to a more formal Q&A, and then very happy to mention some tips and tricks on that area as well. And then just a comment on the comment that was provided on the tone. Absolutely, the enthusiasm is of the utmost importance. And in all honesty, there are two factors that I believe come into the play of that topic. Is one, don't present on something that you or yourself are not passionate about. And that becomes a bit of a difficult thing because sometimes your boss tells you, please present on this, and there's absolutely no way to get excited about that. I would still encourage try, because your excitement, your passion, your energy is going to come through with the tone, the body language, and everything that you're bringing to the presentation. The other part of it, when it comes to the enthusiasm, is always bear in mind that you are going to be the most energetic person in the entire presentation. So if you are not energized, if you are not enthusiastic about the topic, I can promise you that no one else will be. If you're coming across as bored, and I've heard presentations like this, and it's mind-numbing, it's terrible, and you feel like you just want to go away halfway through, if not before that. That's the challenge to the presenter. Keep the enthusiasm, keep the energy, and I actually have some tips and tricks on that even a little bit later as we get into the content. Perfect. Then I'm going to move on, if that's okay. We can catch up with some more questions a little bit later. Now, there wouldn't be a presentation about presenting if there wasn't a slide about slides. And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because this is usually the same old story that we do hear a lot about, but I do want to mention some highlights when it comes to slides. So we want to make sure that our slides, if we are going to use slides, that it needs to be simple and clear. We need to make sure that the story itself is clear from those slides. We don't want it to be a distractor in the presentation, and we also don't want that to be the star of the show. We don't want people to be focused, oh, those slides are just absolutely perfect, but then there's the most boring person in the world presenting these slides, because that will distract them from the greatness of the slides. We also want to make sure that the content is actually relevant and that it actually adds something to the presentation. Too often than not, we as presenters want to hide behind the slides. We don't necessarily want to be seen. We don't want to have to talk about this topic. We rather want to sit back and then let the slides do the talking. And often I've fallen into this bracket as well. We just want to read the slides, but then we need to ask ourselves, was there even any reason for the presentation if we're just going to be reading the content? So I've always had the approach, in my opinion, that less is more when it comes to the slides, unless it's really going to add something to it. We also have an option when it comes to slides, that it can be a good way of giving a summary to our audience. It can be a situation where people can't make it or needs to drop off the call halfway through, and they might want to miss something, and it could be rather important. We want to make sure that those topics and items are clear within the slides, so that somebody knows who couldn't make it, that this is what was discussed. And if they want to discuss those topics more, they can, of course, reach out to the presenter or the faculty or the department to get more information on that topic. That's super important. It also helps us as presenters that it gives us a little bit of a structure. You know, as the audience, now that I'm going to be tackling 4 different buckets. You know that during the case, if we're at a second or a third bucket, you know we're coming towards the end of the presentation. It gives you, as the audience, some sort of expectancy with the presentation. And that sometimes helps, at least with the way it goes forward onwards. Pictures, graphs, and animations are things that I'm incredibly passionate about, because I would rather not use words if I can use graphs and pictures. And on the point of pictures, I have done my absolute best, and thankfully it worked out, to only use free pictures. So if I go online, there's some wonderful websites. One in particular, I believe, is called Pexel. If you look at Pexel free images, you can get some free images there that is not copyrighted. You can paste them into your slides, and that helps just give some life to your slides. But often, more than not, because you're working for a company, the company will sometimes provide you with templates that you need to use. And that will have certain formats and styles. And some companies might be very lucky to have a very mature marketing department that might give input into that. All of those areas and things play a role, which can make your slides look even better, or of course, very company coordinated with various colors. So sometimes we are constrained with what we can do there, but within the best of your ability, let's try and make our slides a bit more interesting, but more importantly, that the message and the story is absolutely clear. That is the most important part of having slides, and for it not to distract from the actual presentation. I do have an example as a slide that I like, and this is just linked to my style. In the next slide here is a very simple little slide that tells the story as to different general insurance reserving methods. We can look at, on one side of the scale, a very statistical approach to reserving, where we look at our basic chain ladder method. On the other side of the spectrum, we can look at a more assumption-driven approach when we look at our IELR loss ratio approaches. But if we want that perfect blend of both, of having statistical and assumption-driven methods, we can look at our BF method, or otherwise known as the Bjorn Ferguson method as well. So difficult concepts, simplified, not too busy of a slide, but it gets the message across even to a non-actuary that these are some of the methods that we look at as a little bit bite-sized information for us to understand and easy to take forward as we go along. I might just pause there on slides. If there are any questions or comments about slides, we can take those now quickly. Maybe just one question.
There aren't any comments about slides specifically, so you're happy for a different question?
Sure, let's take one additional question.
There are a couple of virtual questions which I think we can talk about in the Q&A in more detail, but maybe dealing with expectations. So what if you are in reporting and the results are terrible and you had to explain what parts of the business went wrong? It would be very hard to be enthusiastic.
You blame it all on underwriting. No, it's not. So in all seriousness, yes, sometimes the message that we're wanting to get across is not a nice one, and it's very, very difficult to motivate people afterwards. And in my opinion, I would put it out there at the beginning. You want to make sure that in the presentation, the main message might not be a good one. Put that out right in the beginning. And you can state it as simply as, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time today. Before I continue and before I start on this bit of a journey to explain the results from this quarter, I would like us to firstly understand that it was a very difficult quarter. It was a quarter where things happened that we didn't expect to happen, and that does reflect in the P&L. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today of the factors that have contributed to that. And perhaps at the end of the session, we can talk about action points on how we can go forward from here to improve on these areas going forward. So that could be a bit of an example of how to put a lighter mood to a bad situation, focusing on how can we fix this, as opposed to, oh, it just went so terrible, guys. No one's getting bonuses. We're all going to lose our jobs. No, I would probably not do that. At the same time, the board, or most of the time, the stakeholders you're talking to, wouldn't be 100% surprised by the bad news you're about to tell them. They should, in all likelihood, have an idea that things weren't that good. You are there as the actuary to give a bit more detail on why things went bad and possibly give some mitigation techniques on how to improve those going forward. So I might just go on from there and hope that that's answered your question, but great question, so thank you for that. So onto our next slide, I'll just talk about something that I'm incredibly passionate about as well, is getting into the zone. And when I say getting into the zone, it's about making sure when you're preparing for the content, you want to make sure that you have actually seen and you've tested the venue. In our context, is to make sure that the technology, which is incredibly volatile, will actually work when you want it to. So for this session in particular, there were at least about 3 practice sessions to make sure that finally I could share my screen in this content. And you know what? All it took was that I had to use my wife's laptop and not my work laptop. And then it finally worked. You also want to make sure that the background, the area that you're presenting in is familiar to you, know what's going on. You know, if I put my hand out this way, that way, I'm not going to knock over a vase. And that also my computer is of the right height. All of these different things are part of the preparation stage. Make sure audio, the video is working. All these things become quite important. You also want to understand your audience. It's very similar to the polling questions that I brought up in the beginning. You want to practice your tricks. Now, what I mean by that is if there's anything fancy that you want to do during the presentation, and what I mean by fancy, I really even mean if you want to tell a joke. Tell the joke to somebody beforehand. Don't try out your new joke or your new great story in the actual presentation. Now, when I tell a joke, or on the odd occasion that I might try to be funny, I hope that people are laughing. So this is probably worse when it's a live audience and people just don't laugh at your joke. That's terrible, and that's when you just want to end your presentation and it becomes really a horror story. So possibly just practice those tricks beforehand. I've mentioned about setting up your background and your desk, and that's really, really important. And testing your stage in which you're in to make sure that you know where you are, you know what you're doing, so that you can present in the best way possible. The last little tip that I have is a little bit of a secret and works for me, is that something that helps with the nerve factor, because you will be nervous. I was nervous before this presentation, and I've given lovingly hundreds of presentations before this. And that's good, because if you are nervous, that means you care about the topic that you're actually presenting about. But some things that help is having some tea beforehand, not coffee, unless coffee is the call and you need to have a coffee because you're about to pass out. Tea helps with the nerves. Sugar actually also helps with the nerves, just a little bit. Don't have a piece of cake, but just something small that can help you with that bit of a sugar energy push to help with that bit of enthusiasm. And then lastly, my personal preference is listen to your favorite song. If you need to be motivational, or if you need to punch home a big message, you yourself want to be pumped up and ready to do that. And that really, I listen to It's My Life by Bon Jovi, which probably shares a little bit how old I am, but it's a great song and it gets me into the mode itself. I'm going to push on a little bit to our introduction section, not because your questions are not important. I love your questions, but I'm going to leave them on a little bit later on in the session so we can do a consolidation question Q&A section. But I want to get us through a little bit more of the content, and I hope that is all right for our audience today. We're moving over to our introduction. So in the beginning, this is the part of that introduction where you want to make sure that you are feeling a little bit more comfortable and relaxed. Because as I mentioned, when it comes to that nerve factor, you will be feeling nervous because there's a bunch of kinetic energy that's built up with inside of you. You need to somehow release that energy. If I can share with you my weakness, so to speak, my weakness is that my left hand shakes. And I don't know if the picture is in HD, but you could possibly see that it shakes. I can't control that because that's the way my kinetic energy works through my system. The way I get it out, and that I don't stutter or that I don't say the ums and ahs as much as I'd like, in the introduction is the place where you can get that all out. You'll notice that I use my hands a lot. I'm moving a lot. I'm using as much facial expression as I can because I want that kinetic energy to be used in a useful way. I also am going to be starting my presentation with something that I know. If I'm about to give a reporting presentation, I'm worried about the figures. I'm worried about what is this amount, that amount, is it correct? Am I using the right terminology? But before focusing on that, which will stress you out, rather first focus on the basics. My name is Ryan. I am from South Africa. I've come to Australia for the last 2 years. I love it here. Easy things that are easy for you to remember and things that you can just talk out. It gets out of those initial nerve factors, other than jumping straight into the content and saying that this year's results were horrible. And everyone's going to frown at you, and then it's just going to go pretty poorly from that stage onwards. So that's what I mean by say what you know if possible. Also, the idea behind the introduction is to get into a bit of a rhythm, understand the way that you want to do it. You want to make sure that your tone, your body language, the speed in which you're talking is of the utmost importance and that you are feeling comfortable with that. You don't want to speak too fast, you don't want to speak too slow, but you also want to make sure that you can vary it along the way as well. You want to make sure if it's something that you want people to understand, such as the 2 points here of rhythm and being yourself, you possibly want to slow down a little bit. But if you want to get to the next slide and get people excited about something, you might want to speed up your tone a little bit because we're getting to something quite exciting about the presentation. And I want you to feel that enthusiasm, excitement coming from me. But most importantly, those were all focused about you, but the main objective of presentation is that you want to make sure that your audience are being connected to. And that's coming from me looking at the lens. It's me speaking with you, not at you. It's me about having polls. It's about getting that energy going that you hopefully want people to connect. You want people to listen to what you actually have to say because it's quite interesting. Else you wouldn't be having a presentation at all. You want people to engage with you. And this is one of the tips that I've had in my past and something that I've learned through experience is the most important thing is not necessarily that you get all 100 facts into the presentation and that everybody listens to every single one of them. No, the purpose here is that you want people to like you, to want to talk to you, to want to listen to you. Because whatever they didn't get in that presentation, they can happily get it after the presentation and come have a chat with you and talk a little bit more about those results to understand them just a little bit better along the way. And then lastly, when it comes to our intro, we want to make sure that we sell the topic and tee it up to make sure that we're ready for the topic at hand and what we are wanting to talk about. Then that takes us to our content section of the presentation. And I might just pause there for one question, Ryan, if there is any, or comments that we can just address on what we've discussed so far.
Sure. One of the questions about getting in the zone, you sort of briefly touched on it, making sure there's a lot of space around you, you're not going to knock over a vase or something while you're presenting. But with your setup at the moment, you can see your upper body and your hands move around. So the question is, should the camera be further away so the audience can see your hands and upper body, or when should it be and shouldn't it be?
And that's a great question. And I think it highly depends on the purpose of the presentation. When I'm reporting results, or if I'm having just a meeting with a group in Europe, I'm not standing up on, in all honesty, a bathroom shelf, which is where my computer is sitting on right now. I'm not doing that. When I'm supposed to be upskilling or giving a motivational talk, this is when I try to stand up so that I have more energy, I have more freedom to move if I need to, but also that my face is not right next to the lens like this, because I don't necessarily want you to be looking at my face so intently. I want to move away just a little bit, which is very similar to a normal conversation, right? We have that principle of personal boundaries. We don't want to cross those and just get straight up into somebody's face. That can be quite uncomfortable. And then also, we don't want to be too far away where you feel like you need to shout, or that somebody is not actually talking with you. So you want to try and find a little bit of a balance, and that really comes with the preparation. I like people being able to see my hands, even though I need to raise it a little bit. But having a bit of a balance that people can see what I'm doing from a body language perspective. But it really is linking to the context of what that presentation is, and whether or not you can see the camera itself, and also how formal that presentation is. When I'm reporting results on a quarterly basis, and if I'm sharing my screen with the board in Europe, then yes, I would intend, if we had cameras to share, I would tend to want to get dressed up, wear my suit and tie, and then I'm going to stand a little bit so that the people can see that I'm wearing a suit and tie, and I'm presenting as I would normally if I was face to face. And sometimes even having a bit of a whiteboard to my left, and I can use that if I need to discuss certain topics depending on the size and the time. Perfect. Great. Then if we move over to our next part, when we start looking at a little bit of content. So even though we are talking about a virtual format and the way that we're presenting is virtual, we want to keep it personal as best we can. We want to make sure that we're not talking at people, but with people. And I truly hope that that's come across in this presentation, at least, in the manner in which we talk, the tone, the body language. I want to make you feel like you're part of the room that we're in. So in all honesty, I would love you to be part of the room that I'm in. But of course, given the times, that's not going to happen. So just a couple of helpful tips, just given the time that we have left. So on reporting, I would have loved to share with you some of my slides from Allianz, but I'm sure you'd understand that I can't share reporting slides outside of the company. So just a couple of tips that I've put here is use less slides when you can. I try to fit in everything into 3 or 4 slides. If I can't, then it's too much information, especially given the time limit that you may have. Keep the message simple, but yet accurate. You want to make sure that that message is very easy to understand, but it's correct. Use graphs when you can, as opposed to words and lists, because it just means something more to your audience as well. And you also want to make sure that you're telling a story along the way. And that really builds into the tone that you're using. Once upon a time, there was this, it went to that, this was the end result, and our conclusion and action point is this going forward. And as I've tried to demonstrate, given if time does allow for it, is pause for questions. You want to make sure that the board or your stakeholders have the opportunity to ask questions along the way, but then also try and keep control of that over time to make sure questions come out at the appropriate time. Remember, you as the presenter are in control of the session itself. If I look to our upskilling content, and if I try to showcase a little bit of an example, I have included here a bit of a talk on IFRS 17. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire talk, but I might just do snippets as an example for us to understand the kind of method behind what I would do in this kind of a situation. So I'd have a bit of an introduction to IFRS. I'd say that I am Ryan Boyd, but also just a little snippet on that slide to let people know that I may know what I'm talking about on this topic, that I'm a qualified IFRS 17 practitioner. I might then do a little bit of a crowd breaker and a story, but also showcasing a little bit about myself. that I have the Lego Hogwarts set. I enjoy Lego. I enjoy building it. I am ultimately a big kid. And what I love about the Hogwarts castle is that there were so many pieces that came with it. So it took long, it was complicated. I felt like I achieved something after I built my Hogwarts castle, which now sits next to the TV in our living room area. But thank goodness, in IFRS 17, there's not 6,000 blocks, but only 4 blocks that make up our building block approach, or the general model when it comes to IFRS 17. And we're going to go through the theoretical blocks in front of us here today. But again, I want to talk to these topics. I don't want to read what these different are, but the pieces of our Lego set or our building block approach really starts off with the BEL, our best estimate liability. And we want to understand what that is so we can explain that in just general talking terms. And we can go through each and every single one of these building blocks with the official definition, but draw attention to those blocks when I want to draw attention to them. If I were to just show this slide, the temptation for the audience is that you want to go to the last part or try to understand and read what's going on here. But the key here, using animation and some tricks, is to make sure people only look at what you want them to look at any given time, therefore listening to the journey that you're taking them on. Here's another nice, I believe is a nice example of trying to understand the new terminology that we'll be experiencing under IFRS 17, linking to what we now know as premium provisions, future to know as the liability for remaining coverage, and also the claim reserve component, which will be future known as the liability for incurred claims. And how do we match this to the building blocks that we just discussed? Well, for our liability for remaining coverage, we have our 4 blocks, which are all linked to this topic. But for the claim side of things, we only have 3 of these blocks, as of course, there's no profit component to our claim reserves. So that's a bit of a simple example as to some of the content that you can use, and I hopefully have tried to illustrate some of that in those examples. And if there are any questions or comments on the content section, I would ask that we can talk about those possibly in the Q&A session, or possibly just after our next slide, where we talk about the conclusion and the question components of our presentations. Now, this is something that sometimes gets forgotten when it comes to the presentation itself, because we feel like we've done the job. We've gotten through the journey. We finally are done with the content. Everybody knows what they need to do now. We've done the introduction. We had enthusiasm. It was wonderful. Right now, I'm feeling quite tired. I have no reason to care about ending this off, but that's my challenge to us as an audience. This is exactly where we need to take the message that we've built upon and take it home. This is where we want to build it upon, and we want to make sure that we've also summarized a lot of the topics that we've spoken about. In my example, I'm just including the 4 different buckets that we've discussed. It's not an over-encompassing amount of detail, but it does give us a bit of a reminder on the topics that we've discussed along the way. We've discussed about the effort that goes into the preparation and practice of our presentations. We don't want to forget about those because it's a vital part of what we're doing, and we know where we should be focusing our time, not only in the content, but also, of course, on the tone and the body language that we're using in our presentations. We've spoken about the more traditional parts, the introduction, but also how that helps us as a presenter to ease into the content and also feel a bit more comfortable on what we're doing, but also focusing on our audience, making sure that they feel that they are being connected with and that they are part of the conversation. Content is content. We know what we need to do there, but it's about simplifying the message and making sure that it really connects to our audience. And lastly, as we've just discussed now, is our summary. And I want to share with you just one nice, neat trick when it comes to question and answers. There will come a time, as we've seen today, people will ask questions. Now, this works for virtual as well as in live audiences, that sometimes you will not know the answer to the question. I've done that too many times to share that I did not know the answer to a question. And the important part of that is to make sure you as the presenter remain in control at that point in time. If somebody asks me a question that I don't know, the last thing I want to do is, oh man, that's a good question, and what do I do with that? No, that's the last thing you want to do. But what you want to do is possibly delay answering the question. So what I've done in the past is I would say, well, if John asks a question, John, thank you so much for your question. That is a fantastic question. And I'd love to know, what does our audience think? Maybe you can just pop down in the content or the comments section what possibly any ideas that the audience perhaps have on this question. In that way, you are incorporating the audience, which makes them feel that they're part of the conversation and contributing to it, while your subconscious is trying to figure out what the answer is to the question, and perhaps somebody might inspire the answer by their comments. Worst case scenario, if somebody does not give an answer, you can always be upfront and honest, but yet still remain in control. John, that was a fantastic question. And in all complete honesty, I don't actually know what that answer is right now. But what I'm going to do is that I would like to investigate that a bit further. And perhaps you and I can touch base after this presentation to hopefully find an answer together. By doing that, I haven't necessarily lost control. I've been honest that I don't know the answer. But I've also invited the opportunity for us to investigate this topic a little bit together after the presentation. So that comes to the end of this first session, but I might just give an opportunity, if there are any, maybe just one question at this time, Ryan S., that we can address before we take a bit of a break or hand over to Harrison, who's going to take us through a bit of a piece.
Sure, sounds good. There are a few questions coming through now, so we'll definitely have to get to some of them in the Q&A. But what I've chosen here is, and I never like to listen to my own voice, but you may, but do you ever record your presentations and listen back to them later?
Yes, I have, is the short answer. And yes, I hate it because you never want to see yourself talk. And me, myself, I enjoy getting feedback when it comes to presenting anything. I love people telling me what was good, what was bad. In particular, I want to know what was bad. I am my own harshest critic when it comes to presenting. So I want to make sure that if I can improve, I do that. But people have told me, I've had many situations, including with my wife, where she would tell me and look at the presentation, she will think it's amazing. And she'll be like, oh, that was so good. And I'm very humbled that she's so kind. But I will look at it and say, that was just absolutely terrible. But the temptation is not to do it. I would encourage you to record yourself, listen to yourself, try to improve on it, and go through that bit of a painful task. I will give a shout out though, just speaking of my wife, that slide that you saw about the reserving methodologies, that was in fact made by my wife. So she's very gifted at creating some really good slides. And she used a free software called Canva. So if you're ever looking for some really good templates free of charge without copyright, Canva is a fantastic source or resource for that. So I think at that point then, I hope that we've addressed a lot of the topics on presenting, which I am incredibly passionate about, and I hope that it can help you in your presentations going forward. I know there are some questions and comments that we haven't gotten to. We're going to keep those. We're going to save those. Ryan's on top of that, or Ryan S is on top of that. And then we'll circle back and look at some of those questions in the formalized Q&A section at the end. But what we're going to do now is that Harrison G from the Young Actuaries component or department within our institute is going to talk a little bit about something, an opportunity for all of us to get involved with if possible. But then after that, after we have heard from Harrison, we're going to have a 10-minute break. So keep it written down somewhere, 10 minutes from that point in time. We're going to have a bit of a break and then come back and talk a little bit about facilitating and how that is different from presenting. And I'm going to give you some homework. I'm actually going to ask you during your break, when you get some coffee or tea or anything you'd like, is possibly think about what are the differences in your mind between presenting and facilitating. and then we'll address that topic after the break. But at this point, Harrison, over to you. And thank you everyone for your time. I've really enjoyed this first session.
Thanks, Ryan. Can everybody hear me and see me? Hopefully that's all good coming through. I'll just share my screen. So my name's Harrison, and today I'm going to be presenting some initiatives that may be of interest to you. So firstly, the Young Actuaries Advisory Board are organising a series of engaging your audience workshops to provide you with the opportunity to practice what you've been taught by Ryan today and some other soft skills on a semi-regular basis. The YABB aims to host several Toastmaster-esque workshops throughout the year, where at each workshop, groups of around 7 people are assigned to a virtual meeting where one participant will be the chair of the meeting. 4 people will each present a different topic at the meeting, and 2 people will provide some short constructive feedback to the presenters. Each presentation will be for around 4 to 5 minutes each, with the topics provided prior to the session and will be of a non-technical nature to ensure that all members of the Institute can participate. Examples of these topics could include explaining the rules to your favourite sport, whether you prefer dogs or cats, or why pineapple definitely belongs on pizza. Essentially, the workshops aim to provide a low-stress environment for you to learn these high-stress skills that will be very useful to you at all stages of your career. And I just want to emphasise that this is open to all members of the Institute, not just the young ones, because everyone can benefit. As this is a new initiative by the YABB, the pilot session will be held in early April, with the workshops being held approximately every 2 months throughout the rest of the year. If you're interested, please keep an eye out as the registration link will be posted on the Institute Bulletin in the coming weeks. The second initiative is the Public Policy Council Committee has launched an essay competition for the young actuaries. In 2020, as we all know, the most critical issue facing society was the impact of COVID-19. Accordingly, the essay topic for 2021 is how has the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated the value of actuarial thinking? Entrants are also able to address one or more alternate supplementary questions listed on the website. And this is a great opportunity for you to improve your writing skills, as well as the potential to win a nice prize and to get your name out there. Entries close soon, so if you're interested, you should definitely check it out. So that's all from me. Hopefully I haven't given a showcase of what not to do, but back to you, Ryan. Thanks.
Thanks, Harrison. Just to reiterate, we're having a short 10-minute break. And during the break, Ryan B has asked you to reflect on what are the differences between presenting and facilitating, at least in your mind. Please feel free to leave your Zoom window open during the session, and I'll be back in 10 minutes to welcome you back. Talk soon. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We'll now continue the session. And just a reminder, we have plenty of questions coming through, but the Q&A button at the bottom of your window, you can use that. I'm grouping up the unanswered questions at the moment, and we'll go through those at the discussion point at the end. Thanks.
Perfect. So welcome back, everybody. It's great to see you again, or pretend to see you, because I can't really see your faces. I really hope to this point in time that tips and hints and tricks, so to speak, have been quite helpful along the way. There are still more to share, and in this session, we're going to be focusing more on facilitation. But before we talk about facilitating, I may just share what I actually did during my break as a helpful little hint for you if you're doing your presentations as well. Breaks are fantastic times to, first of all, give homework. So if you want to give homework to the audience to get them thinking about something, it also gives them a little bit of a taste as to what's to come in the next session. Another thing to do is not only for the audience, but it's also for you, or for myself in this instance, to just regroup. You've just presented, or at least in my respect, for an hour. And in that hour, we've covered a lot of different topics. I, of course, will be a little bit tired by the end of that. So this is a good opportunity for me to maybe even go to the loo, get some water, have some tea, have a little bite of something to eat maybe before the next session, just to ensure that I have sufficient energy to carry on to the next session. It's also a really good time to go through your notes for the next session. You want to make sure that the next slide deck or the next slides that you're wanting to go through are ready, it's working, you can share your screen quickly, but also it just helps you get to the next stage to know what you want to talk about, again, with the same level of energy that you had in that first session. I can't stress that enough, that you as the presenter do not want to lose energy. Because as we mentioned earlier, you will have the highest amount of energy. If people to see that you're bored, or if you're tired, they are going to feel bored and feel tired at the same time as well. So I feel great. And on the other side is something to share from the first session as well, is to remember that I hope, and I may have failed at this, that I don't want to come across to you like I'm checking my notes the whole time, or to know what's next, or to come across like I might not have been prepared enough. So what I try and do as a bit of a tip is I ask questions, I give opportunities for others to ask questions, and in those 1 or 2 second split delays between these different actions happening, that is a fantastic opportunity for me to look down, because in all honesty, I have all my notes on a tablet just below my laptop, so I can see what's coming next. I know what the next section is, and hopefully the transition looks and appears and comes across smooth at that time. So that's just a little bit of a helpful trick and tip beforehand, but we are going across to facilitation. I would love to know if we were in a live audience, or you are absolutely most welcome to put in the comment section your thoughts and ideas as to what are the big differences between presenting and facilitating. And to kick us off, I actually just want to play a little bit of a game with us. And again, it's one of these risky situations where I absolutely hope it works, but let's give it a go and see how it works. But I'm going to share my screen in a moment's time. And what I want to encourage you to do, if you can, perhaps you maybe have a piece of paper with you, or you have your laptop or computer, you have a pen on hand. What I want to suggest that you do is, in a moment's time, I'm going to play 5 sounds. And of these 5 sounds, I would love for you to guess what those sounds actually are. Maybe it's a motorbike. And if it sounds like a motorbike, maybe just write that down, make a mental note, type it out on your computer, just something to keep record of what you thought that sound was. So this does require us to listen carefully, and hopefully the technology works, but if it doesn't, that's life, that's what happens. But let's see if it does work for us. So you should hopefully be seeing my screen. Maybe Ryan, could you just confirm that that's the case? Ryan S., I think you're muted.
Sorry, lost the window there. I can see your screen.
Perfect, fantastic. And we're going to hope that the sound works out. But of course, Ryan, just interrupt me if it's not working on your side. So round one is going to be 5 sounds. Jot those down, what you think they may or may not be. And then at the end, you'll see the answers. And let's see if you actually got it right. So I'm going to pause it there. Hopefully you heard the sounds. Maybe Ryan, I can just confirm with you very quickly, with
Yes.
the sounds audible?
Yes, they were.
Perfect, fantastic. So hopefully you have your guesses ready and you could hear what it was. I have a sneaky suspicion one of them was a lion, which I love lions, being South African, got to see a few of them. But here comes the answers. So we have a dolphin, we had a dog as the second sound, a sheep for the third sound, a mosquito, the most annoying sound in the world. Although I have a sneaky suspicion that the mosquitoes in Australia are very different from the ones in South Africa. The mosquitoes in Australia, you don't even hear. You just wake up with a whole bunch of bumps all over you. In South Africa, they at least make themselves known by the sound that they make. And then the last one, I guessed correctly, it was a lion. So I hope that you got some of those, but we're going to play one more round of this game and let's see how we do in the second round. Sorry, that was still the first round. Here comes the second round. One of those sounded like a squeaky toy, I would have thought, something that I would expect one of our pets to use. But let's see if everybody else got it right. Hey, I'm very proud of that. I got the squeaky toy right, and I think I got everything else incorrect. But on that note, hopefully that was something that worked out and something that we feel like we could enjoy. And I hope that you also got most of those answers right. So I'm just going to see if it's working still. Yep, perfectly fine. Okay, great. Then on that note, what I would suggest, and why I did this game, was something for us to look at from a point of view of getting us back into a zone. So when it comes to breaks, and the reason why I did this is we're talking about facilitation. Facilitation is a topic which really the major big difference is the participation of your audience. You want to make sure that your audience are always actively involved in whatever you're actually doing, whether that be coming up with new ideas, brainstorming, whether it's a game, something to get involved with. And all I can suggest to you is if you just Google online or virtual icebreakers or games, you will find a ton of them. And in fact, the one that I shared with you today is courtesy of a YouTube channel called The Magic Source. A great guy named Yuri, he's a good friend of mine, and he does a number of these types of presentations focusing on how to run a facilitation session, how to run a virtual meeting. Great source of information if you are keen on that. So I'm going to try and share my screen again, just with the actual slides this time. And let's see if this goes away. Perfect. So can't show that yet. So Ryan, can you just confirm that you can see my slides?
I can see them, but we're not in presenter view.
Perfect. I will move shortly. And now?
Perfect.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much. So as we said, this is session 2, and this is just a shout out again to that YouTube channel, The Sound Game. Why is this a useful game? Because it encourages you as the audience to listen very carefully to the sounds that you're hearing on the actual game itself. It's not just a random game to get us involved, get us excited, but it actually has a reason behind wanting to do it itself. And that's something that I would definitely encourage. When you are wanting to use games or crowd breakers, let there be a reason for that. Because that crowd breaker or icebreaker really sets the tone for the following sessions or for the rest of the actual facilitation session. And hopefully now, people after playing this game would be encouraged to want to listen carefully to what you're saying after they had to listen to the game very carefully. So when it comes to your content, so to speak, or the agenda or path forward, or even structure of a facilitation session, there's absolutely no difference to the buckets that we would use in a presentation versus what we would use in a facilitation session. You still will need to actually prepare and practice that session beforehand. And I would even say it's even more important now. Because you need collaboration between the audience and people, that whole concept that I mentioned a bit earlier about try out your joke beforehand, please, when it comes to facilitating the session, try out the games, the icebreakers, the brainstorming ideas, try out those things with friends of yours or people that you'd hope would give you an unbiased answer to how it's going. You want to make sure that they work, hopefully, within a greater scheme of things, that they work quite nicely when it comes to the actual show or presentation that you're wanting to do, or the actual session that you're wanting to do. The introduction is absolutely key. As we've mentioned before, this is where you set the tone and the energy and the excitement for the session. You want to be passionate, you want to be there, you want to be ready, and you also want to encourage people to get involved with what that presentation or what that facilitation session is going to be about. At this time, you also want to make sure that you're teeing up that topic very effectively. You want to make sure that it's very clear what you're wanting to achieve here today as a unit or as a team. And this is even applicable to our virtual meetings these days. I'd like to ask, how often do you attend a meeting that you felt was a complete, utter waste of time? I really hope this is not one of them, but in your meetings at work, there may be many of those. What I try and do is I encourage people to send an agenda beforehand, so you know exactly what's coming in that meeting, whether it be virtual or in person. But when you are doing your introduction, you want to make it very clear what the purpose is of this collaborative session. I want people to know that we are expecting you to actually participate in this meeting or in this session. And a nice way of doing that is possibly even giving a little bit of homework beforehand, a pre-read or a question about, why don't you think about the differences between presenting and facilitating? It gets us into a little bit of the mode of what we're wanting to achieve in that session. Unfortunately, for this session that we're in, the one drawback of having a large audience, which we do, we at this point have 101 attendees, which is absolutely fantastic. It's really exciting to see. But with over 100 people, you can't have breakout rooms, so to speak, or there's a certain limit of when you can go, depending on the registrations for the session itself. So then you want to try to make it collaborative and to try and make it interactive, but trust that your participants and audience are actually doing something on their side, and hopefully encourage an environment for people wanting to use the comment boxes, leave questions, and so on. Those things are quite and rather, and if not the most important thing, is to keep it collaborative along the way. When we look at our content, rather than speaking to the content for the actual session, you would love to encourage people and the audience to come up with the ideas and the answers themselves. And this can be in the form of various different games. You can have a brainstorming session, you can have some sticky notes, and I have some helpful hints on the next slide, which we'll get to. But the main purpose behind that is you want to make sure that you create an environment, whether physically or virtually, to use the tools and software out there to encourage people to participate and come up with answers. Even if you know the answer, you can psychologically guide people to the answer that you're hoping to get, or at least creating an environment where a new and better answer can actually show itself or be inspired by other people. That's the real richness that comes from a facilitation session. And then at the end, I'll talk about the conclusion and some extra question tricks for facilitation. I might actually just pause there and ask, Ryan, any questions or comments about facilitation at this point in time?
Nothing about facilitation, but there is probably one good question left after them. You might be able to relate to the topic. And that is, how do you manage the flow of delivering a presentation when you're also receiving IMs from the event owners or other presenters? I found it hard to read those, capture what they're saying, and adjust what I'm already presenting. And I guess that, may be relevant to facilitating too. You have this path forward, but something interrupts that, and how do you quickly change course?
Absolutely. And that's a fantastic question. And what I've learned through failing at this a million times before is that you want to actually build that into your session, your facilitation and presentation. You want to make sure that the goal and the plan that you had may or may not actually be the plan that eventually occurs. Because you want to be aware of your audience. Now, this is easier when it's a live audience because you can see whether somebody is either getting bored, or if the audience is getting bored, people aren't reacting, they're not participating. And there could be even a situation where somebody asks a question which you didn't even have any idea you wanted to answer in that session, but that's where the focus is at now, and that's where you need to probably focus in a little bit. I build that in, and that's why I asked the poll question right in the beginning. I asked, how experienced are our audience and how much do they know about presenting? Because if they're comfortable, then I'm not going to waste their time by just talking about complete utter basics. I'm going to shift my presentation to version 2 of it, where I talk more about some advanced tips, some experience, things that I've learned through failing, things about that area that people might not know from the theoretical answer. What does help in terms of the virtual side, when you're getting feedback, I have currently, if I can share with you, I have a WhatsApp group which has members from the Actuarial Institute, from the Events Coordinating Committee, as well as I got Ryan S on there as well, and they can give me feedback. And the best time for me to look at their feedback is when I take a pause or ask a question, and in those 2 to 3 seconds, I have it right below me. Here's some feedback. I can see without you knowing that I've taken back in some feedback, and then I can change my presentation going forward. The other helpful thing in the situation is someone like a Ryan S, because I'm not looking at your Q&A or comments at all. Ryan S, however, is, and he's busy managing that behind the scenes, so I wouldn't get distracted by seeing a bunch of questions and comments coming up, because I've had situations where people are mean sometimes, and people can actually comment there, oh, what is he wearing? Or what's this? And I was like, oh, that's pretty hurtful. And then it throws off the rest of your presentation. So I trust, and this is the whole point of having a good team behind the presentation. And to forward what I was going to say in the beginning, this is not necessarily me at all. This is a team effort in terms of what the presentation actually ends up today. And it's because of great people like Ryan and Donna and people at the Institute helping us out with this kind of a session. Hopefully that answers the question. It gives a little bit more context as to how to deal with those things. But as always, there's a lot more that can be said, and happy to have that conversation even in the future if you'd like to reach out to whoever asked that question. Great, then we're going to move on to our next slide, where we talk a little bit about some helpful tips and tricks in the grander scheme of things when it comes to facilitation. So a very helpful thing that I do when I'm facilitating a session is that I don't particularly want to dictate what we're going to be talking about. I might have expectations and I might have things that I want to get across that I'm going to prepare. But at the end of the day, I want you as an audience, if this is a facilitation session, to know that your questions, that your expectations will be met right at the end or by the end of that presentation. The easiest way of me to do that is to actually ask you up front. So one of these things that I've done in my past and from my experience is that I start off by doing a nice, hearty, energetic introduction. I play a bit of a game, but then what I do is I ask the audience, guys and girls, what do you actually want to get from this presentation? And then I'm going to jot those all down on a whiteboard. Or if I'm on a virtual format, there's some great free brainstorming software. There's a whiteboard software. There's a lot of things that you can share the screen with. And I know there are things like Collaborate where you can in fact even draw on the screen if you're a participant. There's so much software out there that you can actually use. And I would use that software to just list down what are the people's expectations or the audience's expectations. And that's a nice little trick because you yourself as the facilitator, you know what the agenda is going to be for the day. You can then match what the expectations are with what you're going to be talking about in the day and make sure you address these topics. And if you weren't, perhaps in one of the breaks, you can try and build in something into your session for the hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, however long it's going to be. So there's always ways of being aware of the audience in this regard and building that into your facilitation session to make sure that most of the audience's expectations will be met throughout the session itself. Another nice way of setting up a facilitation session is asking the audience to set up the rules of engagement. Now, what do I mean by that? Any of us that have facilitated a session or even ran a presentation, perhaps either virtually or in real life, where I think it's more of a problem, and I say real life, I mean physically, where you have that unruly person, or you have that person that's interrupting you, or the funny guy that's making jokes at your expense throughout the presentation. All of these things break down the environment and the experience that you're trying to create for the entire audience. Now, the easiest way of getting by that, besides some practical tips, which I can share maybe in future, but you want to get the audience to list down what are the rules of the engagement for the session. You want to give them the opportunity to state that, well, you know, Mr. Facilitator or Ryan, can we have a rule that says, please let's not use our cell phones in the session because it then gives the attention to the actual session. And then you can say, well, that's great. That's a fantastic idea. I'm going to write that idea down. And then you jot that down on your board or onto your virtual board or anything you like, because you can then even encourage certain answers. If people are not giving answers, you can very easily say, does anyone here hate being interrupted when they are busy talking? People will most likely say, yeah, no, that's horrible. Well, that's a great suggestion. Why don't we jot that down on the board here, saying that let's not interrupt each other when we're actually trying to talk, or let's not play on our cell phone. In this way, you are creating a world, whether it be a virtual world in this facilitation session, that is firstly created by the audience or by the participants. In this way, later on, if somebody breaks one of these rules, it's not you that have created these rules. You're not the bad guy. You can say that, come on, everybody, we've now discussed these rules in the beginning. These came from you. And I think we're not adhering to those rules that you guys have come up with during this session. How about we bring it back and let's just continue respecting each other, or let's continue listening to each other. And you can have a lot of fun with that. You can even have the tennis ball of shame situation. If somebody breaks the rules, you can toss them the tennis ball of shame, and they have the tennis ball of shame. And their idea is that they need to point out somebody else that breaks the rules of the session. There's a lot of fun games you can play around with that. And again, all online. If you just Google these things, you'll find so many different great ideas that you can play with on these different types of games. Breakout groups and breaks are fantastic ways of keeping a session interactive and making sure people are participating. A psychological rule that plays well with this is a breakout group of 2 groups with 50 people each, in all honesty, if I can be blunt, is useless. But if I have 10 groups of 10 people, or even more, say more groups but less people in each group, what that encourages is participation naturally within the group. It's too easy to hide away if you're part of an audience. But if there's only 3 or 4 of you in a group, it naturally encourages people to start sharing as opposed to hiding away without you having to be that bad guy and say, oh, John, why aren't you participating? Sarah, come along. That embarrasses people. But if you want to naturally encourage it, there are nice ways of doing that. And we've also spoken about breaks and the use behind using breaks to encourage people to think, talk, get up and move, walk about, get some of that energy going throughout the session. We've discussed a lot about software and different kinds of things you can use. There's polling, there's brainstorming sessions. And I would encourage you to, in your preparation, spend some time looking at that and what's available online for free in most cases. Or you might be fortunate and your company itself might actually have some great ways of facilitating sessions. We've discussed whiteboard and movements, but the last point that I want to bring out here is when it comes to games and running games throughout, practice these, make sure that it has an end goal and an objective you're wanting to achieve through that, but also make sure that it keeps people engaged. I saw a really nice one once where there was a friend of mine, he was facilitating a session. Now he didn't have a see-through glass, but he had a cup or a mug. And his game throughout the session was to ask people, can you guess what's in the mug? And then people would write in the commentary about what's in the mug. And this would be sort of a running game that goes throughout the entire session, in between questions and topics and agendas. This would be a random someone saying, oh, jelly tots, or is there coffee in there? Or is there something more hardcore than coffee? Now, and at the end of the day, there's no necessarily a natural objective to getting that or getting it right, but it encourages people to listen to the session because, you know, my friend may or may not give hints as to what's in the coffee or what's in the mug. So little tips like that, psychologically, you can naturally use to be able to get people to get engaged, listen, and get involved with the actual content or what you're trying to talk about. So those are some of my highlight tips and tricks when it comes to facilitation. And I'd like to move towards just ending off our entire session / both sessions with some key points and things that I'd love you to take home with. If you're not home already, calling in or just getting online into the session. But overall, the structure remains the same. We still need to prepare. We have an introduction. We have content that we want to deliver, but the delivery of that content may or may not be different depending on the circumstance or situation that we're in. The conclusion and questions are still exactly the same format. We want to make sure that we keep enough energy for the end so that you can make people excited about this topic. You want to make sure that you also create an environment where people want to ask questions and want to have a good chat about the topic that you're talking about and feel comfortable to do that as well. And also create a challenge or an action point as to what can you do with everything that we've discussed here today. Something that might not make sense on my slide is, well, here's this random 5 rules of engagement. And to be honest with you, I myself have looked online. What are the keys to presenting? And what are the best ways of going about it? And funny enough, every single time I always find somebody give, these are my 5 rules to follow and you will be a wonderful presenter and you'll be the best presenter in the world. So I thought it would be amiss if I didn't give you my 5 rules of engagement on how to do presenting. And something that's not going to make you the best presenter in the world, because that's not the point of why we're even talking about this. We're talking about this to empower, encourage you to be your best version of what presenting you can give, and also given the context of when you're presenting it to our stakeholders. So my 5 rules very simply are, whether it's facilitation or presentation, you want to keep a structure and you want to keep control of the session as best you can. And we've shown and shared a couple of tips and tricks on how to do that. But again, very happy to discuss that at any time in the future, should you be interested in that. The audience is absolutely key. This whole thing is about the audience itself. What I love about that is I watched a TEDx or a TED talk, must have been about a year back, where there was a lady and there's a good reason for this. I can't remember the lady's name, but I remember the point that she was making, which isn't that really the point of a good presentation. You don't have to remember the person, but remember the points as to what was really the story behind what they wanted to say. She said that the temptation for all of us, now I'm taking a chance here and hoping and thinking that there might be some Star Wars fans out there, but there's a chance and a temptation for us to want to be the hero of a presentation. We want to be the Luke Skywalker of Star Wars. We want to save the day. We want to bring balance to the Force, when actually our focus should be the Yoda of Star Wars, where we are there to empower other people and to support them on their roads. Because isn't that the focus of what we're really wanting to do? Is to impart a message to hopefully make a difference in other people's lives, whether it be theoretical, motivational, or any form of presentation. Another key part, which we've answered some questions on today, is awareness. Making sure that during the presentation, you are aware of how things are going. If your audience wants something different, give the audience what they want within reason, but still keeping control of the actual presentation. And also know if it's time to stir things up. Have some games if it's a facilitation session just on inventory, just to have there in case things are getting a bit dull. I've got this game and I want to play it quickly. Let's do it. And if there's no need for it, then there's no need to use it. Preparation is something that's, of course, as we've discussed, key, and then we've mentioned that in the prep and practice bucket. But the last point that I want to make here today in this session is we focus too much about making sure that we speak line for line exactly what we have to say. The temptation to have a script underneath your screen when you're talking. And my suggestion, at least my experience has been, that that's going to lead to more nerves. It's going to lead to more mistakes because you're so focused on the content that you need to say. And what I've done in sessions, because I've run the session before, I've done one-on-one practice sessions and training back in South Africa. This is something I'm very passionate about. The first thing I do with one-on-one sessions is I just ask the individual, just stand up in front of the room and talk. Don't worry about the content, just speak. Talk about what you know. Talk about your family, things that you enjoy, hobbies, where you're from, because then you see the person come out. And that's my biggest tip that I would want to give you. Everything I've spoken to you today is not about just copy, paste, do. It's about adjusting it and helping it empower and encourage you to be your version of an expert. Become your own expert in presenting, because you're not me and I'm not you. And we're going to have different styles. And through practice, through doing this a lot, through playing with the idea and concept, you are going to become an individual and you're going to be unique. And that's what the point of that last picture is on the right-hand side. And I'd like to leave you with a quote from one of my favorite movies, Hitch. Yes, I know it's an older movie, but it's such a funny and great movie. But one quote that was really fantastic is, life is not the amount of breaths you take. It's the moments that take your breath away. And that's exactly what we're trying to achieve as presenters. Yes, sometimes the topics might be difficult to do that with, but really that is still the objective. We're wanting to make a difference with the words that we are saying in presentations. We want to make sure that people take something from that session to either going to change their work life, their personal life, whatever the situation is, you want people to take away something with it. And that's something special. And it's really a great opportunity that we have as actuaries in our different roles to be able to make that impact in other people's lives. So before we get to Q&As or the time that we have left, I would really like to thank you for your time and for coming through this journey with me for the last 2 hours or 1 hour and 50 minutes. I've really enjoyed it. I've loved it. Thank you for the questions, which we'll get to now a little bit. And I really hope this could have made a difference in your life, and hopefully it wasn't a waste of your 2 hours, but something that you can take along with you, as well as the 4 CBD points that you get for attending this session as well. But on that note, I might ask Ryan S., over to you. Are there any questions or comments?
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks for all the tips and tricks along the way. We have a few questions to answer, so we can go through those. I've sort of tried to group them up in topics, and then everything else I've just sort of put in another bucket for now. But a very important topic of the day at the moment is always, what should we do differently when we're presenting virtually? And that's become the reality for a lot of people, and it has changed things. People are happy to share the background of their home, and maybe the cat will jump across the table occasionally, things like that. And you learn things about your colleagues and some of your clients as well. But one of the questions that came up earlier was, in this new world of virtual meetings from our bedroom, are people's expectations not adjusted such that the tie and whiteboard aren't really necessary anymore? I generally don't even bother dressing up for meetings I would normally have, that I normally would have, because I'm presuming that people's expectations have adjusted. Or will those above and beyond bits of effort really be appreciated still, do you think?
Mm-hmm. And that's a fantastic observation, and I agree with you to a large extent. Excuse me. But this also lands into a different bucket. Even before COVID, I believe also the dress code was changing naturally, where once upon a time people were wearing a lot of ties, suits. That changed. I don't think it's only in Brisbane where the tie became a thing of the past, but that was naturally happening to a certain degree to become a little bit more informal than what we may have been way back when. For board meetings, I feel that sometimes, depending on the situation, there is still an expectation to do the whole tie and fully suited out situation if you are going to be sharing your screen. Now, not to leave my answer too vague and say that it just depends on the situation, but I do want to give a helpful hint in that regard, is each meeting and each environment or way that the meeting is going to go is going to be different. If that is the culture, or if that is the way that meetings are conducted in the meetings that you're involved with, great. By all means, if that is 100% certain, because the last thing you want is you're the only person wearing just a vest, shorts, and tongs, then that might be a little bit embarrassing, especially if the other person's wearing a suit and tie and that person signs your paycheck. You don't necessarily want that kind of a situation going forward. So what I would suggest is, again, being aware of the audience or the circumstances, the people that you're working with, the company culture, the way that you do things, and that's all great. If you don't know, there's no reason not to just be the most well-dressed person in the room. There is obviously a measure of doing that. You don't have to do suit and tie and that kind of thing, but you do get away with wearing a shirt. I took a risk. I got my sleeves rolled up, but I am wearing a shirt, no tie. And to be completely honest with you, I am wearing shorts, but you wouldn't know that because you can't see the bottom half of my body. So those are the kinds of things I would suggest just keeping in mind in those circumstances.
All useful tips. And I think everyone's been in that position where occasionally they might be a bit underdressed for a meeting, and the way to always be confident in presenting is probably just be overdressed, and at least you won't be worried about it too much.
Exactly.
Good tips. Related to that as well is, how much does the background of the presenter, so what's behind me and what's behind you, influence the delivery? What background style would be the best for marketing, technical discussions, or other topics? Or do you think it doesn't matter too much?
Sure. So it matters to the point where you don't want whatever's behind you to be a distraction. Now, I've noticed what people do show behind in their screens. And to be honest with you, the most common background that I've seen is a bookshelf. And I always find that quite funny, because you find a bookcase, and what's the first thing you think of when you see a bookcase? Oh, wow, this person is smart. They know what they're talking about. Until they possibly zoom in and find what books are there, then you see the or comic book collection, which is probably what you'd find in my bookcase. But the situation why you want to care or what's there is that you would like an environment where you don't have your washing hanging up behind you, you don't have a complete utter mess behind you, because that does build an impression to the people that are watching you. It gives them an idea as the kind of person that you may or may not be. And that's somewhat unfair for both sides, because that might not be the person you are, but we're human beings, and we unfortunately judge with our eyes immediately. And it's difficult to get out that first impression if that is what is actually just the first thing that they've seen is a complete utter mess behind you. So my advice has been that try to keep the environment behind you as clean, as attractive as you can. I try to have what I have behind me. I have a painting, I have a plant, there's a picture to the bottom left of my wife and I on our wedding day. All of these kinds of things show you a little bit about who I am, just to break down a little bit of barriers if they are there, because it is virtual. And hopefully nothing too distracting behind me, but there are things out of our control. So a virtual meeting would not be a virtual meeting if there wasn't a cat or a dog or a child or your partner or somebody walking behind you. Hopefully they have clothes on, but they just YouTube that and you'll find 1,000,001 different examples where that goes wrong. I had my first example not too long ago where my wife was trying to fetch something, and all you saw on the screen was my wife jumping behind my back to get something, thinking that she was so fast that nobody could see her. And that was one of those sessions. The last thing that can be added there is possibly a situation where you have a virtual background. Those work and don't work, and this is purely my opinion. So please forgive me, but I personally don't like them, only because when you move or you're using your body language, there's a bit of a fuzz that happens where the software is not necessarily taking your movements into perfect synchronization. That distracts me as an audience, but that's purely my opinion on the topic.
Thanks. You may see for the participants a poll coming up, so please provide your feedback. We have 5 questions left, and I think we can maybe do a speed round, Ryan, and answer them as quickly as possible. But if there are any more, send them through quickly and we can address them after the session. One last one on virtual presentation is, there's been that research where body language is very important, but do tone and words have a higher weight now that we're virtual and there's a bit of a less presence of, someone being in the room?
Yeah, I would say the short answer is that if it's virtual and you're not sharing your camera, then tone in the manner in which you speak is the be all and end all, but that same ratio applies. Less emphasis only on the words. That's not to say it's not important, still very important, but tone becomes incredibly important. And the body language, when you are sharing your camera, I hope it would have made a difference for this presentation with me showing you body language and walking and talking and that, as opposed to if I didn't share my camera, just to give a short answer.
Yep, sounds good. There's also sort of 2 notes, which is the first one is if you could share the free resources you mentioned after the presentation. So I think Canva and maybe some tips for the facilitation, some games and things. And also from another 2-part question, which is what type of presentations or research, I guess, has been done to show that body language is important. So maybe 2 things we can provide after the session.
Yeah.
But also from David, I get the significance of tone and body language if you're wanting to sell yourself / convince people you're right. But I wonder if that applies to more routine actuarial presentations.
Yeah. So in the short answer to that is it not one and the same? When you're wanting to present an actuarial topic where it's number driven reporting, the balance sheet has moved or the reserve has moved from X to Y, at the end of the day, you're wanting your audience to have confidence in the person that's communicating that message. You're wanting to make sure that they can have faith in that and that they have the opportunity to feel comfortable to ask you as the technical experts questions on that topic. So I would respectfully say challenge that by saying that I personally believe it's exactly the same concept. You're still wanting not to sell yourself, I wouldn't phrase it that way, but you are still wanting to portray yourself and create a comfortable environment for the person who you're presenting to.
Sure, and I guess it comes back to understanding the audience and reflecting their behavior and really judging the room or virtual room in this case. 2 last ones, there's a minute left. The first one is from Milton, and it's any tips on presenting mathematical or statistical equations or models. You gave one demonstration of a slide earlier, just 3 pictures and 3 words beneath each, but any other tips?
Sure. So again, very briefly, you need to ask yourself the question, do you need to provide all that statistical and mathematical detail? There's a difference between presenting to a non-actuarial audience or if you're doing training to an actuarial audience where they need to actually understand that. Sometimes that helps to give us a bit of a pre-read. If it's an actuarial audience, here's the data and the stats backing up, or some of the formulas that back up what we're going to talk about. Maybe take a quick squiz at that. And then during the session, we can talk a little bit about that. But even that, if you're talking about different variables in a model, the important thing is not to focus on the formula, but focus on why the formula works. Why is that variable important? Why does this variable interact with that other variable? Why does the statistics make sense? So you can build your own Lord of the Rings saga of a story that can intertwine with that type of discussion and upskilling session. It's just about spending good time on that and trying to make it interesting.
Thank you. And last question, how do you avoid debate in Q&A? Is it good? And maybe also in the facilitation, if they're in small groups and there's a lot of debate happening, either individually or when they come back together. A quick question, quick answer, and then I'll wrap up.
So the mute button. No, so you don't want to mute participants, but at the end of the day, you want to make sure that, again, those rules are adhered to. We're respecting to each other, and we're all professionals. So we do want to speak respectfully and professionally to one another. There will be disagreements, there will be debate, and that's good. And sometimes, depending on the session, you may or may not encourage an opportunity is, let's have a debate. Let's split up the room into two. Please share your points as to why you think this is right. You share your points why it's wrong. Let us, as a facilitator, jot down those points, and let's maybe agree to disagree, and let's continue.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of the session. Hopefully you've all taken away some valuable tips and provided your feedback as well that came up just a moment ago. I really enjoyed the presentation. A couple of great tips were, first, to have a pump up song before you present. Maybe not Bon Jovi for me, but I'll pick something else. And also just, really trying to bring some more energy into the presentations, especially where you're taking a main role, using some games and things like that to keep people energized. These 2 hours have gone quickly. We've been able to stay focused and really take away some valuable tips and tricks for our next actuarial presentation or whatever it will be. Thank you for presenting. Thank you to the attendees for coming along and staying with us. And also thank you to the Institute, especially the events team, for organising today. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.